Alright my friends, so let's begin by talking about how we can actually manage our network devices. Now what we're going to do is talk about two distinct approaches to actually handling this particular problem. One is called in-band management and the other one is called out-of-band management. Now before we actually look at these different approaches, let's just define what we mean when we're talking about managing a device. So really all we're talking about is being able to make changes to our networking devices. Perhaps we need to make a configuration change. Let's imagine, let's just say we've got a network here of OSPF across here and OSPF across there. You know, we have Ethernet links, and because of this, they are going to be a broadcast network. So effectively, if you remember what we talked about with OSPF, we're going to have an election for the designated router. Let's just say we wanted to speed up and optimize our network, make a change in the network. We would effectively want to log into our switches all here and make the necessary configurations to perhaps change these links to be simply point to point. This would be an example of a configuration change. This is us managing our devices. Now the question is how do we actually get those configurations onto the boxes themselves? Now this is when we come to the point of if we're going to approach this in-band or out-of-band. So let's first start with the concept of in-band management and describe how we would make such a change to these interfaces across these devices. So when we're talking about in-band management, we're talking about using the same network infrastructure as our regular traffic. So let's imagine that these devices here are part of the general infrastructure. So let's imagine this was a very small corporation. This could be a switch in one building. This can be a switch in another building. And we have one PC here, one PC there, and one connected here. And this can be used for general operations. So pretty much these are your user end devices who actually use the network for work purposes. Now this one right here, this one is just a dedicated device used to manage the network. This is where the network administrator connects into the network and makes any type of changes to that particular network. So let's imagine we have OSPF running across these devices. And what that means is that this PC here can effectively connect all the way through the network and reach this end device right here. But in a similar sense, that also means that this particular device, the management device, could potentially go and remotely log into the switch by traversing that very network we're using, the OSPF network that's been configured across all the switches. Basically, this guy here is using the exact same network infrastructure that all the users are using to send their data. Now let me just tell you straight away, this here is actually not optimal because quite simply, because we're effectively sharing our management network, which is going to be used to monitor the devices with the general users, this is going to be less secure, and also, by the way, it's going to be much less stable. Let me give you an example of how that might happen. So let's say this, okay? So the way this particular management device logs into this switch up here is by writing over the active OSPF configurations on these devices, including, by the way, the OSPF configs on this switch itself. Now, right now, as it stands, without OSPF, this device here has no way to actually get to this particular device. Now here's a potential problem. What if when we are remotely logging in to this particular switch, what if we happen to disturb the OSPF configurations? Maybe we type something wrong. You know, maybe we accidentally put this interface here into area 1 when it should be in area 0. What is the net effect of that? Well, if this one here is in area 0 and we change this one to be area 1, effectively we completely sever the OSPF adjacency. So now, essentially this portion of the network becomes invisible to OSPF. So the solution, of course, is to go in and actually just readjust the configurations and put things back as they were. However, the question is, how are we going to do that? Think about it. How are we going to essentially reach this remote device in a different building perhaps that can no longer be reached due to the OSPF misconfiguration? This is the problem. Because we are effectively riding over the active network infrastructure and we happen to make a modification to that infrastructure itself, we potentially can disturb the network that we're riding atop to get to our remote devices. So whilst this at first glance might be easier and perhaps quicker to set up, whilst that clearly might be the case, it's also, as we can see here, vulnerable to misconfiguration. And again, it doesn't have to just be an OSPF configuration. You know, maybe this device here is once again remotely accessing over the network this device. And once again, we do something silly like shutting down this interface. Now all this network here becomes black hole to you, And once again, because this device here is actually remotely located, and we have no way to actually reach that device due to the current configurations, we can't just log back into that device and no-shut that interface and bring it back up, because we can't actually reach it remotely now. So whether it's breaking routing protocols, whether it's shutting down interfaces, tons and tons of potential misconfigurations can effectively lock you out of a large portion of your network, which, as we can see right here, one no-shut on this interface would black hole the rest of the network upstream for the management device. And that, my friends, is the type of problems we have with in-band management. So perhaps you may be getting the sense that in robust modern networks that really have to be accessible, we might want to introduce a different solution, and that is exactly what is often the case. Instead, many people tend to use something known as out-of-band management. So essentially what we're going to do with out-of-band management, we're going to actually have a separate network entirely that is used to connect to the devices that will allow us to access them, but it's completely separate from the configurations of the devices used to carry the user data. So imagine this, okay? Let's imagine we take this connection out just now, okay? And instead, let's say our management device here connects to a new layer 2 switch, okay? Let's just say that. So we draw the connection, and from this point on, this layer 2 switch actually connects to this one here, this one there, and this one here as well. Now, what if we could actually configure this so that this portion of the network, all these interfaces, were in a completely separate network entirely? So imagine that this interface here was on the address of 192.168, just do 1.1. This one here can be 192.168.1.2. This one here can be 1.3, and this one here can be 1.4. Now again, imagine for user data, if this particular device here wanted to talk to this end device here, we could still have OSPF running across these interfaces as so. And this is how these end users would ultimately connect to each other, okay? However, if the management PC wanted to log in to this particular switch here, we could say, for example, have shared interfaces over the same layer 2 domain. So the cool thing is that this particular device can reach via this dedicated switch into this other switch right here. And say for whatever reason, we happen to, as we did before, break the OSPF adjacency across this link here because we happen to have a misconfiguration. Well, even though we have effectively broken the path for the users to reach each other, so this guy here can no longer reach this one here because the actual path across this link here is now severed, we as the administrator down here can still ride our dedicated network to log into the switch or the switch right here and effectively correct the misconfigurations to ultimately bring this link back up. Because the cool thing is, this dedicated management network that we have right here, we don't actually have to be making configuration changes across these particular interfaces, okay? Because as per this example here, it's just a simple layer 2 topology separated from the actual data network, because all the configuration changes we're actually making are directed at the network that is used to carry the user data. Now here's also one other advantage. Let's say we'll happen to go back to using in-band data. So this particular device here, if it wants to manage this particular switch remotely, once again is riding over the actual interfaces used for the user data, okay? Say for example, this interface here and this interface there, riding over, in the example we did, OSPF. Every time this management device is going across these interfaces, we are using a bandwidth that is ultimately taking away bandwidth from the actual users on the system. Whereas if we happen to have our dedicated network, the out-of-band network, the way the actual management device communicates with any of the switches is by going over separate interfaces, thus not clogging up any of the bandwidth for the actual end users. Now you might be thinking, well, just because we happen to have different interfaces plugged into the same switches, that isn't necessarily giving us a separate network. And quite honestly, just with general configurations, this would be true, but as we're going to learn in the very next video, there actually is a way to completely isolate this separate network using some type of virtualization. So how about we talk about how this is done in the very next video.